Hello, everyone. My name is Sam Jack. I'm a librarian at Newton Public Library, and we are so pleased and appreciative as well that Jim Hoy has returned to us. Saw probably some of you were at Jim's presentation on Kansas folk tales and tall tales that was part of our summer library program, and he's got a new book out, My Flint Hills, and agreed to come and talk to us about that and about whatever he wants to talk about, of course. Here's a little bit about Jim. He received his PhD in medieval English literature from the University of Missouri, Columbia, and is the former director of the Center of Great Plains Studies at Emporia State. And he has published, well, the Bible says 17 books. I'm sure it's more than 17 now if you include My Flint Hills, and over 150 articles. And he authors Plains Folks, a syndicated newspaper column. So, oh, actually, I skipped over. I was going to do a few quick library announcements as well. So let me just do that. A couple that I think people attending this will probably be interested in. Coming up next on Thursday, March 4th, we have an author talk with another local author, Newton author, Michael L. Ross. He is going to come and read from and talk about his book, The Search, which is the second in a series called Across the Great Divide. And this one is kind of in the aftermath of the Civil War. So that'll be really interesting to hear about. And then later on in March, on March 16th, we've got kind of another historical program. John Brown, Image versus Reality is the title, and that's going to be given by Grady Atwater. Grady's the administrator of the John Brown Museum State Historic Site in Osawatomie. So that's going to be a really cool thing to hear about that museum and also about John Brown. And then a week after that John Brown program, we've got a Fourth Tuesday photography with Jenny Gegg talking about portrait photography, which is probably, if you want to take your own portraits and stuff. There's more details about everything going on at the library on our website and on the Facebook page. So I will leave it at that for library announcements. And here is where I should have done the little biographical excerpt about Jim, but hopefully you all can remember that from a few moments ago. And I will turn it over to Jim. We'll have time for Q&A after the Jim's presentation portion, whatever he's got planned. And Jim, thank you again.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed my last Zooming there at the Newton Library, and I'm going to enjoy this one too, I'm sure. Well, my topic tonight is the Flint Hills, and particularly my 18th book. I'm up one from what you said there, Sam. Yeah, it's called My Flint Hills. And there's the cover. This is available at your bookstore there in Newton. I think it's called Faith and Life or Life and Faith bookstore. And they do have some copies there if you're interested. But that's my father with the black hat, my uncle with a light colored hat there in the middle of a Flint Hills pasture. And a lot of this book is about family, and a lot of it's about the cattle and horses you find in the Flint Hills. A lot of it's stories I picked up, various things that my lifetime in the Flint Hills. All but 4 years of my life have been lived in the Flint Hills area. That's 4 years I was at graduate school over at Columbia, Missouri. Well, the Flint Hills extend from, here's a little map, extend from near Nebraska. They run up into Marshall and Washington County just a little bit, and they go all the way down into Oklahoma. This very southern tip right here, they call them the Osage Hills in Oklahoma, but it's all part of the general Flint Hills region. They cover, I don't know, parts of 15 or so counties in Kansas, Osage County down in Oklahoma. And it is primarily a tall grass region. In fact, that about 6 million acres you see there, about 5 million in Kansas, million in Oklahoma. That 6 million acres is the last that's left of a tall grass prairie in America that once was 170 million acres. From Indiana out to central Kansas, from Canada down to Texas. The whole huge area was a tall grass prairie. Today, this is the what's left of it, but even that remnant is the largest undisturbed tall grass prairie anywhere in the world, bigger than anywhere else in the world. There was a huge tall grass prairie, for instance, in Argentina, the Pampas. And the western part of the Pampas, the dry part of the Pampas, is kind of like northeast New Mexico, West Texas. It's dry. But the eastern Pampas, the Pampas humido, Pampas with the humidity, with the water, was huge. But now it's all crops. It's all wheat, soybeans, milo, corn, just as in here in the central part of the United States, what once was tall grass prairie is now cropland. That's because in order to have tall grass prairie, you have to have between 30 and 40-inch average rainfall. Well, 30 and 40-inch average rainfall will darn sure support crop agriculture without irrigation. But what saved the Flint Hills was the flint, the rock. You can't plow up rock. In fact, there's a story told about a pioneer family coming out, the covered wagon, probably in the mid 1880s, something like that, early 1880s. And they're traveling along and they're met by an Osage Indian. And they stop, they talk a little, and he points to the plow that this homesteader had tied to the side of his wagon. He points to the plow and says, "You'll have a hard time sticking that thing in the ground here." That's because of the rock. That's the only thing that saved the Flint Hills from being all plowed up and turned into farmland. Now, the thing is, we do have the average rainfall, and we do have some really wonderful, lush soil here in the bottomlands. In the creek bottoms and the river bottoms of the Flint Hills, you have deep black soil that is good cropland. And that's why as you drive through the Flint Hills, if you drive through the bottomlands, you're driving through cropland. And you get up into the uplands, you're driving through grass. You start out in a little town like Cassidy or Matfield Green, place like that, and you drive out east or west of those two towns, and you're going to be driving into, you'll see crops on both sides of the road. The higher you get, the farther in it you get, the fewer crops you'll see, and you'll get up to a point where you cannot support crops. It's too rocky to plow up the ground. And that's what saved us from becoming all cropland. Now, it also makes the Flint Hills ranch land different from any other ranch land in the West, in the American West. In most of the American West, well, the average rainfall runs from 6 or 7 inches a year out in Nevada, Eastern Oregon, to 15, 16, so there in West Texas. And the only crops you find out there are irrigated cropland, and the bottomlands they'll irrigate and grow hay. But during the summer, their cattle run up into the mountains, run up and out into government land. And in the fall, they bring them in and they feed them that irrigated hay to keep them alive during the winter. But in the spring and summer, fall, then they go back out on the land that you and I own, the government land, where they pasture out there. Here, however, the hay and the other crops that you find in the bottomlands produce abundantly. And you have therefore a mix of farming and ranching in the Flint Hills you do not have in West Texas or Arizona or Utah, places like that. There it's either up in the mountains where the government land is or irrigated down in the valleys. But here We have crops and we have pasture. You know, if you remember in the musical Oklahoma, there's a song called "The Farmer and the Cowboy Can Be Friends." Well, here in the Flint Hills, the farmer and the cowboy are often the same person. He drives a tractor one day, he rides a horse the next. He's good at growing crops, he's good at raising cattle. Um, so that is one of the three major distinctive features of the folk life here in the Flint Hills, a mix of farming and ranching. Now, not everybody does it. Some people just farm in the bottom, some people just ranch in the uplands, but some do both. But you have this mix, farming and ranching. Another thing that really makes us different here in the Flint Hills is the annual spring burn. This is something the Native Americans did for hundreds of years. They burned and burned and burned. In fact, Africa, Australia, South America, every place that Europeans colonized, the natives were burning, because that was one way they cleared the ground, one way they got new growth, one way they could attract animals, one way they could fight their enemies, various reasons they burned, but they were burning constantly. First thing Europeans do when they settle a new country, when they find, explore, lay claim to new lands, whether it's South America, Africa, Australia, here in North America, they stop the natives from burning. They stop the burning. And what the result is, we get terrible, terrible wildfires. The forest fires in Colorado, the forest fires in California, the terrible fires they have in Australia weren't that bad at all when the natives were there before Europeans invaded, because they were burning constantly here, there, everywhere, and the vegetation did not have a chance to grow thick. Now it does. And people out in California, people there in Oregon stuff, they want to have their house out in the middle of these forests, and they don't want anybody cutting the forest. They don't want any fires out there. And they stop the natives from burning. They build their houses out in there, and the undergrowth builds up. The fire fuel really builds up. And when a fire does start, it goes crazy. In those countries where the natives are burning constantly, it never had a chance to build up a big fuel base, and the fires were never devastating. A fire would burn through the forest, but not kill the trees. And we stopped that, and we created these terrible forest fires. The natives burned all over what's now the United States and Canada. When the Europeans came, when the English, the French, whatever, Spanish came, colonized, they stopped the natives from burning, and now we have these big fires. And they stopped burning except in one place, the Flint Hills. I have a oral history interview from the Council Grove area in which the man says, all this country, when the Indians were here, they burned it all the time. And they burned it for the same reason we burn it. They burn off that old dead grass, and new fresh green grass comes up. It drew in the buffalo. We burn it, and then new grass comes up, and the cattle have easy access to it, and it is powerful, powerfully strong grass. But he said, and we learned from the Indians how to do that. He said they would gather in the spring, gather big balls of grass, wrap them up with rawhide, set them on fire, and a man with a rawhide lariat would drag that ball of burning fire and scatter fire until it ran out. And yeah, so we continued to burn in the Flint Hills in the late 19th through mid 20th century in stiff opposition to farmers, to the towns and cities, and to the scientists. The rangeland scientists up at Kansas State in the early 20th century said you shouldn't burn. It's a bad thing to burn. The county extension agents told everybody, don't burn, don't burn. It's hard on the grass. It's terrible on the grass. Darrell Marlowe, who was a county agent up in Wabunsee County, said that I knew I was supposed to tell ranchers up here not to burn. But he said, I couldn't help but notice that these guys that were burning, they had fewer trees, they had better grass, their cattle got fatter quicker. So I just kind of kept quiet. And then in the, I think it's in the 50s, a range scientist from New Mexico came to K-State. And he had it in his head that burning was a good thing. But he couldn't do much experimenting down there in New Mexico because New Mexico is the home state of Smokey the Bear and they don't like any fires, wildfires. But here he could come up to K-State because he knew that they burned in the Flint Hills. So he began to doing experiments and he discovered that you got more grass on an area that was burned. You got, the cattle would gain 10% more weight on burned pasture. You kept the trees, you kept the weeds, you kept all that down if you burned. And he soon proved that burning is a good thing. If you ever visited Deconza Prairie Natural Research Area up there around Manhattan, you shouldn't, if you haven't yet, need to visit sometime. They'd cut that up into watersheds, 100 and some different watersheds, and they mow around each watershed so they can burn them at different times. They burn some in the fall, some in the spring, some in the winter, some they don't burn at all. 2 plots they didn't burn at all, and both of those in 30 years got entirely tree covered. I think they're getting rid of the trees on one, but in a generation or two, the Flint Hills could turn into nothing but a forest. Scrub forest, not good trees, but hedge trees and eastern red cedars and locusts if we didn't burn. So not only is it good for the cattle, that ash fertilizes the ground, it keeps the trees and the weeds at bay. Burning is a good thing to do, and it is something the Indians did before we ever got here, and they were right. But they used to burn in the whole country. They stopped people everywhere except the Flint Hills, and people here burned despite the opposition to it until they began to do different experiments in K-State and approved the good of it. And don't worry about contributing to global warming because all the carbon that goes into the air with the grass fires in the Flint Hills gets absorbed during the summer by the grass. And some scientists indicate that even more carbon is put in the ground than goes in the air from the spring burn. So despite people complaining in Wichita and Kansas City and Omaha and Lincoln, it's a good thing to do. They just need to not run their cars quite so much during that month when they're burning, and they'll keep the pollution down and the smoke won't be so bad. Anyway, that's the second thing, hallmark of Flint Hills folk life. Mix of farming and ranching, annual spring burning, and the other is summer grazing of transient cattle. The grazing season in the Flint Hills begins around mid-April, runs to about mid-October. The height of that grazing season is from around 1st of May to the last of July, 1st of August. And it is the best grass in the country, best grass in the world, I think, but then I'm a native, so I'm a little bit prejudiced, for putting weight on cattle, on stocker cattle. I have helped ship cattle that gain 3.8 pounds a day eating nothing but grass. And I have heard of cattle that gain 4 pounds a day who ate nothing but grass. It's a rare bunch of cattle turned out that don't gain at least 2 pounds a day eating during the summer, eating nothing but grass. It's wonderful grass. The tall grass, it's called tall grass spray because big blue stem, the seeds go up 8, 9 feet in the air. Little blue, they go up 3 feet or so. The The leaves of the little blue will go up nearly a foot, big blue will go up a couple of feet. And you also have the Indian grass, and you have the Indian grass and switchgrass, and then other grasses, side oats grama, blue grama, all, there are probably 100 different kinds of grasses in the Flint Hills, but the four big ones are big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, and side oats, and not side oats grama, but switchgrass. That's the tall grass. And it is wonderful stuff. It puts weight on. In the spring of the year, from around 1st of May till toward the end of July, those leaves are packed with protein. And that protein puts weight on an animal. They used to ship up steers here in the on the railroad from Texas that were so gant and poor they could hardly walk. Some of them were dead on the car. Some of them died soon after they got off the cars, but if they could make it out, graze for a week, they started gaining weight so quickly, it was just amazing. And they would come in here, 45 steers to a railroad stock car. They would leave 25 to a car. They couldn't get any more than that on. They had gained so much weight. So that's why it's famous throughout cattle country as steer country. Way to put on weight on stock or cattle. Cattle between weaning and time they go to market. Nowadays, when they go to feedlots, they've just gained tremendous amounts of weight. Now, the cattle have changed. When I was a kid, well, when my father and my uncle were young, they still were shipping some longhorns up here, 3, 4 years old. When I was young, on the railroad, they were shipping up mostly 2-year-olds, 2 and 3-year-olds, and they would be just, as I said, thin as rails, but they would really put on weight quickly. Nowadays, long about 1970, they switched to yearlings, and now everything is put out here as a yearling, not an older animal. Now the thing is, those older animals would really pack on the pounds. Yearlings will put on a lot of pounds too, but not as much as those older steers did. The yearlings are also a different kind of animal to handle. Those older steers had been rounded up several times in Texas, and in the railroad days, most of them came up from Texas. Now they come from all over. I've helped on a ranch near Cassidy that pastured Florida cattle one year. And Kentucky cattle are not unusual. New Mexico, Colorado, Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, Missouri, other parts of Kansas. They come from everywhere to the Flint Hills to get that quick gain, cheap game. And in the old days, they went straight to the packing house. I interviewed an old timer at the Kansas City stockyards many years ago when they still had a stockyards there. This guy had gone to work in the stockyards when he was in his early teens. He was in his 80s when I talked to him. He kept talking about that new building over there, that new building over there. The new building he was talking about was the stockyards building, which had been closed for about 10 years, but to him it was still that new building. He'd been there a long time. He's told me the packers got rich on Flint Hills cattle because they would butcher them and put that meat in the market, out to market, with corn-fed cattle from Iowa and charge the same, price for it. And they would, the stores, the consumers never complained. They liked that grass-fed beef just as well as they did the corn-fed beef. And the packers made a lot more money on that. Yeah, anyway. Today, as I said, it's almost all yearlings. Now, let me back up just a minute. I gave you the 3 hallmarks of folk life at the Flint Hills. Summer grazing of transient cattle, that is cattle that are raised somewhere else, brought here for 90 days to 180 days, and then sent on today to a feedlot, in the old days to a packing house. The second is the spring burning. and the third is a mix of farming and ranching. The history of the Flint Hills, in my mind, and this is my own concoction here, you have this pre-white settlement history, which is the Native Americans. And in the northern Flint Hills, it was the Kansa or Kaw Indians. Southern Flint Hills, it was the Osage. But in the, if you cut it off at 1854, when the Indians here are on their last stand, the Kaw and the Osage get sent to reservations soon after that. But 1854 is the beginning of what I call the trail drive era. All the cattle come to the Flint Hills on foot, driven by men and boys on horseback. That trail drive era, where the cattle come in on foot and leave on trains from Abilene or Wichita or Dodge City, the other cow towns, all the cattle that come in on foot and leave on trains, that ends around 1890. In some places earlier, in some places a little later, but by 1890, nearly all the cattle come into the Flint Hills come in on a train. They're shipped up. Most in those days, most all of them came from Texas on trains, and then they leave on trains. They would ship them up here in the middle of April, and beginning in the last part of July, they'd start to ship them out. Just say you had 1,000 cattle in a big pasture. Each of those big steers got maybe 4 or 5 acres a head. You'd start shipping the fattest ones at the end of July, but you wouldn't take all 1,000, you'd take maybe 100. Next time you might make 75. Next time you might get 150. You'd stretch that out for 3 months till the middle of October when the pasture season ended. So there go the big steers, fat as anything, and a lot of them, as I say, go straight to the supermarkets. But the railroad era then begins around 1890, ends around 1970. Starts after World War I, they start using trucks more. And in the 1960s, they're using more trucks, especially not to bring them to Kansas, but to take them from Kansas to the stockyards. And so the trucking era begins in the 1950s, takes over completely around 1970. And we're still in the middle of the trucking era. All the cattle come in on trucks, all the cattle leave on trucks. Now this had its origin, as I said, in the early 50s, but the cattle changed too. So by the time that the trucks take over, by 1970, there aren't many of these older cattle coming up here. The 2- and 3-year-olds are not coming in here much anymore. Not nowadays, never. They're all yearlings. They're all young cattle. You put them, you wean them from the mamas, you winter them in a dry lot or something, and then in spring, you put them out on the grass, and you can put a lot more, because you give 5 acres to an age steer, you give 3 acres to a yearling. But about 1970, they began doing something else. They began double stocking, early intensive grazing. Somebody, I don't know where they got the idea, and when they first came up with it, I wasn't too sure of it. Now I think it's not a bad idea. From late April to the end of July, that's when we generally get the most rainfall. That's when the grass grows the fastest. That's when the grass has the highest protein content. And one reason Flint Hills grass is so good for putting weight on animals is because those roots of those tall grasses go deep in the ground, 15, 20 feet in the ground. Now, there are three dominant kinds of rocks in the Flint Hills, and Flint is not the most dominant. Limestone is, but you also have shale, and then you have flint rock. Sometimes layers of flint, sometimes just flint embedded in in limestone covers. But the major rock is limestone. Limestone is made of calcium. Those roots of the tall grasses go down. It's a porous rock. The roots of those tall grasses pick up that limestone, bring it up into the leaf as calcium. What's calcium good for? Bones. So these yearlings are getting bigger bones faster than yearlings on pastures in other places because of that of the limestone that underlies the Flint Hills. So that's why they're making these tremendous gains, 3.5 pounds a day, because they're getting limestone to build their bones. They're getting the protein that's putting the meat on those bones. So double stocking has now become common, and I think that most of the pasture cattle in the Flint Hills, the vast majority now, are double stocked. There are still a few that are full season, 6 month. Most of them are double stocked, 3-month grazing season. Yeah, so that was a real major change, double stocking. Okay, so those are some of the major facts, I guess, about the Flint Hills. Sam, I'm assuming that you can take questions on chat if they come in, okay? So if anybody wants to ask questions, do. Tell you a story or two from the Flint Hills, and then we'll see if anybody has any questions. One of my favorite stories, the Flint Hills story, took place, I think, in the later 1930s. The man that told me it took over there in the eastern Flint Hills in Greenwood County. Many times those Texas ranchers would be dealing with Kansas ranchers that they'd never met in person. They'd made a deal on the telephone, or the commission company had set it up. And after several years, many years, the rancher might send up a horse or two. He might send it up so his foreman would have a horse to ride when they cut out the fat steers to send them to market. It might be some mares he was culling out, just giving them as a gift to the Kansas man. Sometimes it was a stud horse. The man could raise some colts. Well, this is over around Virgil somewhere there in eastern Greenwood County. The cattle come in about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. They never seem to come in daylight. Always seem to come at night. Anyway, they got the cattle unloaded, got the lights in the stockyards, of course, got them unloaded, and they're about to leave, and they hear a noise in that last car they unloaded. Someone goes in and look, and there's a horse tied in there. They untie him, they lead him back out, lead him out there in a pen underneath one of the lights there, and they see it's a stud horse. Nice looking, well-built stud horse, and he's got shoes on his feet. He's got saddle sores that have healed and white patches growing on his withers. The rancher just figures, well, my cohort down there in Texas sent this horse up for me to use. So they lead him home, back to the ranch. Next morning, they get up to take the cattle out of the railroad pens, drive them to the pasture. The rancher says to his hired men, says, who wants to ride the new horse? And one of them volunteers, and he throws the saddle on him. Horse just stood there stock still, never batted an eye, sensed it up, gets the bridle on him. Horse just seems to be quiet and calm. He's a stud horse, but he doesn't whinny around the mares or anything. But that guy, no sooner he gets his seat set in the saddle, and that horse just flies apart. He just blows up. He bucks up higher in the kite, and the guy wasn't ready for it. The cowboy wasn't ready for it. He gets flat on the ground, flatted down. Now, the rule is if you're still breathing and the ambulance isn't coming, you got to get back up and get on the horse. Now, this guy's not too eager to do it, but he does, and he's ready this time. He's in for the toughest bronc ride he's had in his life, but he stays on that horse. And they had the cattle out to the pasture several miles away, stockyards and pasture, and then get back to the ranch house about noon or 1 o'clock to eat dinner. And, you know, horse is pretty well worn down by then, and he gets off to open and shut the gate for everybody. And when he gets back on, that horse bucks hard again. He goes in and eats dinner, and he comes back out, and that horse bucks hard again. He just is so mad at that horse. He rides him just as hard as he can. He gets done. That horse is just covered with foamy sweat, and his nose is dragging the ground. He's so tired he can hardly move. The guy gets off, to open the gate at the corral again, and he gets back on, and the horse tries to buck. Can't buck as hard, but he bucks. That was, this guy told me, the only bad habit that horse had. He was easy to catch. He was calm around the other horses and mares. He didn't fight the geldings. He was a good cow horse. Said you couldn't put a steer past him. You could rope a bull and drag him on it. He's just an excellent cow horse, except for that one thing. Every time you got off and on, he was going to buck, and buck hard. Well, no one person settled on that horse. The cowboys on that ranch took turns riding that horse. And it was your day to ride that horse. You went out to the barn early. They didn't have lightning fasteners on their stirrups, and you had to unlace the stirrups and move them, shorten them or lengthen them, and then lace them back up. Well, if it's your day to ride that horse, you went out to the barn 20 minutes early, and you raised your stirrups a couple of notches. So when nature called and you're out in the middle of a pasture, you could just stand up in your stirrups and turn around with the wind and relieve yourself. You did not have to get off and back on again. Yeah, that's one of my favorite stories from the Flint Hills, but there's more to it. About 2-3 years later, the Texas rancher's on his way to Kansas City, and he's reasonably close to Greenwood County, so he decides he'll go visit the Kansas rancher that's been handling his cattle for the past several years. And he calls him up, tells him he's coming. The guy invites him for dinner, of course, and after dinner they go out, get in the Kansas rancher's pickup truck. They're going to drive out and see the cattle. And they're driving out past the barn lot, and the Texas rancher hollers, "Wait, stop this truck." He says, "That looks like my stud horse over there." And he gets out and looks, "That is my stud horse." Says, "My cowboys told me he got struck by lightning 2 years ago." They made up that story, put him on the stock car, and sent him out. I'd like to see their faces when that horse showed up back in Texas. Anyway, that's a nice story from the Flint Hills, I think. Now, if we got any questions, Sam?
Yeah.
Got any questions?
Yeah, thank you. That's a funny story. Thanks, Jim. We've got some
anybody-
questions that have come in. The rest of you,
send
you can
any
type.
in?
Yeah, I'll start reading them on, and then the rest of you can type them in the chat, whether you're on Facebook or Zoom. I'm watching both. So here's a question. Do the Flint Hills or Kansas have representation that is in conversation with the EPA regarding the importance of burning the grass to preserve the grasslands, or more generally suggestions to convince those that aren't knowledgeable about the importance of burning?
Yeah, they do. And 4 or 5 years ago, or maybe a little longer, Kansas tallgrass ranchers and some others got in contact with the EPA, and they've worked out some guidelines for when to burn and things like that. And so it worked pretty well, and the ranchers are following the guidelines pretty well, and we haven't had as many complaints as before. I saw a question pop up here. Someone wanted me to tell a story that took place in the Cassidy stockyards about the time they're loading some cattle. Well, yeah, loading some cattle, and the way you did that was the younger guys that get up on the railroad platforms to handle the bull board, the big old heavy bull board, so the cattle could get in the cars without falling in that 18-inch crack between the loading dock and the railroad cars. But this one time, Frank Kleiser's got cattle there, and there's a guy in Greenwood County named Slocky Brazel who was helping drive the cattle. The older hands stayed on horses and drove the cattle up. What they do would be count 25 head of cattle down the alley, and then they'd cut them off, and they'd take those 25 up to one of the two loading chutes there. And And Slocky, to kind of just slow the cattle, would toss the rope out in front of them to scare them back when they got 25 past. Now, Frank Glazer, like most cattlemen I've ever worked with, like most ranchers, did not like to see a rope anywhere except hanging on your saddle. He did not like to see cattle rope because that ran the fat off them. Most cowboys, however, love to rope. And when Glazer saw Slocky throwing that rope out there, Slocky wasn't trying to rope anything. He's just trying to slow things, head those cattle off. Glazer yelled at him, and Slocky yelled back, and Glazer picks up a rock and throws it at him, I guess Glazer grabbed the board and went for him, and Slocky picked up a board. Anyway, there's a fight about to start, and Glazer decides it'd be better if he'd go down to the depot and call the law. And as he's down there calling the law, Slocky gets on his horse, and he's on his horse. He just rides back home. Yeah, that's sometimes fights did take place there in railroad yards. Yeah, one of my favorites is about they're loading cattle. This is again in Cassidy, and they got a new the train is delayed. Some kind of trouble down in Oklahoma or something. That train doesn't get there till 10 or 11 at night, and they usually get there about 3 or 4 in the afternoon. And this guy, this is back again in the early 40s, he doesn't have a truck. He's got to ride his horse. He lived on the Henley Ranch 12 miles back to there if they get done loading. They were the last ones in, they're the last ones to load, and then he's got to ride 12 miles and get up the next morning at 3 o'clock to help ship cattle again. So, but they got a new engineer, I guess, and every time he stops, instead of being directly in front of the cattle car, he's off to the side or back off this way. And that bull board that you put between there, they said, is really heavy, and the gates, you can, they're slidable, you can extend them, extendable. They don't extend easily, but they extend, and you can swing it around so you have there's no gaps a steer can get out of. Well, every time this guy stops the train, he's there. They got to move all that. And this cowboy says to the brakeman, says, "What in the hell is wrong with that engineer? Doesn't he know how to drive this train?" And the brakeman just kind of shrugs his shoulders. He'd rather be home in bed too. And the cowboy says, "Well, maybe you don't know how to handle that lantern. Maybe you're not signaling him right." And the brakeman says, "Well, if you think you can do any better, why don't you do it yourself?" And the cowboy says, "You're kind of a smart aleck SOB, aren't you?" He says, and he says, heads toward him, he's going to have a fight. But before the cowboy can land the blow, the brakeman hits him in the side of the head with the lantern, knocks him down, sitting in the middle, punching away. And the other cowboys come running up, and the cowboy down on the ground getting beat up, looks up and says, "Get me away from this guy before I hurt him." And of course, the only thing he was hurting is that guy's fists, I guess. Anyway, the fight's over, and they go back to loading cattle. And every time the train had stopped, the brakeman would say to the cowboy, says, "How's that?" And the cowboy would say, "Close enough. I loaded cattle." Yeah, you had some exciting times at those stockyards. Okay, another question.
Yeah, thanks. Well, it looks like
Other questions.
Yeah, thanks. I've got some more come in. Sorry, it looks like your video has kind of stopped working, but we still hear you loud and clear. So we'll just keep going. Let's see here.
Oh, good. Well, I had a note here. It said there.
Here's a okay. Oh, your video went off, but I think you're still there. Yeah. Okay. Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
I shut it off and turned it back on. Thought maybe it'd come through.
Yeah. Well, that's okay. I would just leave it.
I don't have the best reception out here.
But the audio is good, so that's the main thing. Let's see. Here's question from Christy. Is there any particular kind of horse that is or was more popular than others for ranchers?
Yeah, the quarter horses are the favorite among ranchers. There's some, I knew a couple of guys that rode Arabians and Appaloosas, but in fact, when I worked for the Rogler Ranch, I had a thoroughbred that I rode, a 3-year-old thoroughbred. But almost all horses are in the Flint Hills are quarter horses. Back before there was a quarter horse breed, they rode a quarter horse type, and some of the early quarter horse breeders were here in the Flint Hills. But yeah, so the quarter horse is one, and quarter horses are they got a lot of action, they got a lot of agility, and a lot of them have good cow sense. They know how to look at a cow and pay attention to her, and yeah, so quarter horse. Next question.
Question from Judy. How is the agritourism industry doing in the Flint Hills?
Well, it was doing pretty well till the pandemic hit. My son and daughter-in-law at the Flying W Ranch that operated that for many years. My guys, they had thousands of people come through there. They really educated them about the Flint Hills. But there are other tours, bus tours. The Flint Hills Discovery Center in Manhattan is a really good facility, and so is the Pioneer Bluffs down in Matfield Green. Of course, every summer except the last two, and the weather and the pandemic got them. They simply in the Flint Hills. So the tourist industry in the Flint Hills has really picked up. Interest in the Flint Hills has really picked up. When I was young, no one paid much attention to the Flint Hills, but beginning about 30, 40 years ago, interest grew, and now it's really strong. So yeah. Next.
Yeah. Question from Elena. What do you
Another
know
question?
about, Yeah, can you hear me? Sorry. Question from Elena.
I can hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Sorry. What do you know about Teeter Rock?
You blanked out there.
Oh,
Teeter Rock. Oh, yeah. That's out east of Cassidy, my hometown, about 10 or so miles. And it's about a mile or so off the Teeterville Road. So unless you're looking for it, you won't see it. That was put up by one of the Teeters. I'm trying to remember just which one. Wasn't Jim Teeter. It was one of his sons, I think. They were digging pipeline through there, and they had unearthed this great big tall rock, great big long rock, and he either paid him or convinced him or coerced him or whatever to, yeah, it was Merle Teeter, old Merle, I think, that to bring this rock up on top of a hill and dig a big hole and set it in there. Thing sticks up, I suppose, 12, 15 or more feet in the air. And there's another one, probably 8 or 9 feet, that's kind of hold it up there steady and stuff. And people, of course, as they always do, have carved their names on it and stuff. Some people had spray painted it, but I think they caught them, and law took them out there and had them take that off, which is good. And the last time I was out, the next to last time, most of the time when I'm out there, it's pretty well kept, but another one came up to here from there's a few beer cans, a lot of beer cans around it, and they got those picked up. And the last time I was out, there were just 2 or 3 beer cans. They're from that brewery down in El Dorado, and they were Teeter Rock beer. But they got a beer called Teeter Rock beer, I guess. That's kind of appropriate, I thought. But yeah, that's been there for as long as I can remember. So people thought it was in honor of a man named Bugby, I think, who worked for Teeters for a long, long time. But that's not true. There is a stone monument to him about a mile and a half southeast of Teeter Rock, out in a little way out in a pasture with a fence around it to protect it from the cows. And that's his memorial. But this is just, I guess they had built, old Merle had built up a cairn of rocks, because people would stop and ask which way to the Walnut, which way to the south, asking him directions all the time. He'd say, go up to that big mound of rocks in southwest, southeast, north, whatever. And then Teeterville oil field came in, and people at Teeterville began coming up there and getting those rocks off of that mound of rocks to use in building their houses or whatever. And when old Merle decided to put up Teeter Rock, he put it on where his father, I think, had put it there. I see a question now about Mustangs. There are 3 or 4 ranches in the area that have that are pasturing Mustangs. The what was it? The couple of them out east of Cassidy, one up by Matfield Green. One of them has about 10, 12,000 Mustangs, I think. And the Vestring Ranch has some you can see south of Cassidy, just driving on the Rosalia Road. But yeah, we are pasturing. The U.S. public is pasturing those cattle. It's a pretty good deal for the ranchers. They make decent money doing that. Interestingly, a lot of them are pretty right-wing and don't like government handouts, but I kind of see those Mustangs as a bit of a government handout. Anyway, but yeah, you can see them. They're pretty interesting to see.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Melanie wrote, she's curious to hear a little more detail from your book on how the spring burn is carbon neutral, or what makes it carbon neutral.
I learned that from, what makes it carbon neutral? Because when that smoke takes all the carbon in the air, grass is even better than trees for putting carbon back in the ground, for sinking carbon back in the ground, so that new growth of grass begins to pull that carbon from the air and back in the ground. That's how that works.
Yeah, I guess just as much grass as burns grows back every year, I guess. So, and that's, yeah. Kay asked, how long does it take to completely burn off the Flint Hills?
Well, in the old days, they did pretty much burn it. And when the Indians burned, it burned from river to river. And then used to be back in the 20s, 30s, earlier, you'd start a fire, and if your neighbors wanted to burn, everybody wanted to burn, you'd just burn, again, from river to river. But nowadays, some people want to burn early, some people want to burn late, some people don't want to burn, so you have to set backfires, fire guards around the area you want to burn, and then, so it takes a lot longer. I think it is Phil Pinkston or Wendy Pinkston, one of them told me that the hardest part of their job was burning pasture, because they had to set all those backfires. Said it used to be easy, you just set a fire, let it burn. Now you have to set backfires to protect certain things. I know several years ago, I was asked to be on the committee for a master's degree student at Wichita State who was writing about burning in the Flint Hills, and they're just beginning to burn in the gypsum hills down around Medicine Lodge. And she, in her thesis, told how they were starting to burn about 1,000 acres down there around Medicine Lodge, and they had 3 or 4 volunteer fire departments. They had about 100 people there to set and start fires and so on. So at the very same time, roughly the very same time, there was one man up in Chase County burning 2,000 acres all by himself. It's just in our genes here in the Flint Hills, that pasture burning, I guess. So, but they're getting on to it. And then when they had that wildfire down and around Medicine Lodge, down at the other one at Ashland, my gosh, at Medicine Lodge, it would have taken, I've read, $45 million to remove the cedar trees mechanically that fire did in a couple of days. So it wasn't all bad. It did a lot of damage, but that was one good thing that fire did. The Anderson fire, whatever they called it. Okay, other questions?
I have one.
Do you have any more questions?
Yeah, we've got more questions.
Okay.
I was kind of wondering, among the ranchers and landowners that do burn, are there folkways or traditions that go along with that in terms of doing the
Oh
work?
yeah. Not they've they've been more mechanized now. You have they've got water sprayers back around World War II, and they use those a lot. But they also use different kinds of fire starters. Uh, but they invented here somewhere in the Flint Hills, uh, year decades ago, a fire stick, which is nothing but a piece of iron or steel pipe that's capped on one end and has a drip on the other, and they fill it with straight gasoline and drip and set that on fire and drag that, and they can set a lot of fire with that. It sounds like a pipe bomb, but it's not. That's a folk device that was invented for burning, but they also use uh, modern technology as well, different things. Uh, one rancher I know of is in the process of buying a flamethrower to start fires with. He'll set a big fire in a big hurry with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, next.
On Facebook, Kenneth asked, "Are there any archaeological digs happening in areas of the Flint Hills?"
There have been. I don't know if there are any active right now, but yeah, I certainly have. I know down around Eureka somewhere, they one of the richest sea life fossil beds down in there. But then they've done quite a bit of archaeology work, like when they put in the reservoir at Council Grove. They found a lot of Indian artifacts in there when they did the archaeological work before they completed that dam. So I don't know of any precisely that are going on right now, but I know that there have been many over the years. Yeah. By the way, if we don't get everyone's questions answered, I'm going to put up here my email address, and you can email me with your questions if we don't get them all answered here. jhoy@emporia.edu. I'll hold it there a while. I'll say it again, and Sam has got that, I think. And he will, you can email him at the Newton Library, and he'll let you have my email address. jhoy@emporia.edu. Okay, my arms are getting tired.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, another question.
Okay. Here's just one that just came in from Alden. How far do you think we can go with bison restoration? I know the Poppers got in trouble for the Buffalo Commons idea 30 years ago.
Well, there are a lot more bison around now than there were. They have a big bison herd at the Conza Prairie up there at Manhattan. They got a big bison herd at the Tallgrass National Preserve, Strong City, another place you can go to. And they got, I forget how many miles of walking trails at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, Tallgrass National Prairie Preserve, Strong City. So the Flint Hills Discovery Center, Tallgrass Preserve, Pioneer Bluffs, lots of different places you can go to get in the hills too, yeah. But they got bison there, and I'm trying to think. There's a lot of private herds around in the Flint Hills and all over the state too. Yeah, bison's growing.
Yeah. Doug asked, what are some of the largest unfenced areas in the Flint Hills?
The largest what?
Unfenced. I guess
Unfenced? Oh,
areas.
well, when I was young, and I think not that long ago, I don't know if they've crossed fences since then or not, but the Red Ranch out east of Cassidy, Dave Bennett's Red Ranch, was 5,000 acres under one fence. It's one of the biggest that I knew. There are several, I don't know just how big all the the fences are on Shadow Valley or the 777, how big the pastures are, but I know they have some big pastures on Shadow Valley Ranch and 777 out there northwest of Eureka, southeast of Cassidy. Yeah, so there's some decent sized ones. Yeah, there are a lot of them that are 2,000-3,000 acres, and there are some that are just a section too, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Let me see here. Let me see. I guess someone asked if B&S is finished with their track work and restoration south of Matfield Green.
Oh,
Um,
I haven't been by there for about a month or so, but I hope they get finished with it, get that artificial mountain out of there. Seems to me they could have handled that in a different way, but then lots of ways Santa Fe's been good to the Flint Hills too, so
yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, and I guess I'm kind of curious. It's called My Flint Hills. So do you kind of reflect in this book on what the Flint Hills has meant to you over your life? That tells us about
Yeah,
that.
quite a bit of that. And a lot of this is memoir too. It's episodes from my life. I got a lot about my family in here, my family history. My great grandparents came to the Flint Hills in 1877, and my grandfather, when he was a boy, was a herd boy, what they call a herd boy. He loose herded cattle out in the hills. Men from Newton owned a bunch of cattle, and they pastured them out here, and it was his job to take them out toward Jack Springs every day, bring them back every day. And I know people, men from around the Matfield Green would stay out in the hills for weeks at a time, herding people's cattle, loose herding, before they had fences. So yeah, I have a lot of personal experience in here. I have, yeah, for instance, I have a chapter in here on my pet coyote. See, I got any pictures here of that? I think I do. Yeah. That's Spooky, sleeping on my bed. My pet coyote. And then I have a chapter in here on when I was younger, I liked to hunt coons. And here is my coon hound, old Bullet. He's a trained walker dog. And my gosh, he could run the coons, but the sucker wouldn't stay on a tree at all. Fortunately, I had a blue tick and a red bone that would stay on the tree while he was off hunting another one. So yeah, I had a lot of fun hunting coons. And my first teaching job was 8th grade in El Dorado. And I'll tell you, I admire 8th grade teachers. Those 8th graders drove me crazy. I couldn't handle it. But my first teaching job, my first homeroom, 20 minutes longer than any other station, had 3 kids in there, 3 boys just ornery as anything. And they made my life miserable for a couple of weeks. And then I got the bright idea of taking them out coon hunting one night. And Friday night, I think, and it's where the north end of the El Dorado Reservoir is now. Wasn't anything there then, but Walnut River. Took them out, and we got a coon or two, and got back to the pickup around, I suppose, midnight or 1 o'clock, and those guys were lost. They couldn't have found their way home for anything. And after that, they were the unofficial keepers of good things in my class. They wouldn't let anybody else get too ornery. And they were my best buddies after that. So coon hunting paid off for him. Let me read you something from the book. It's good to know that the beauty of the Flint Hills is being recognized by artists, photographers, and others from beyond the region. Equally gratifying that Flint Hills residents themselves are coming to realize how special this place is. A few years ago, a hunter driving through southern Chase County met a cowboy along an open range pasture road and stopped to talk. The city dweller, sweeping his arms in a wide arc, said something about how pretty the Flint Hills were in autumn. The cowboy, after contemplating the view, said, "You know, I've worked on ranches from Montana to Mexico, and this is the prettiest place I've ever seen." He paused and then added, "But you have to love grass." We here in the Flint Hills do love grass, for we live in the largest expanse of native tallgrass prairie still existing anywhere in the world. The rolling landscape and big skies of the Flint Hills are a national treasure. Theirs is a quiet beauty. The Flint Hills is a quiet beauty, one that leads to contemplation. If you want to have your breath taken away by rugged spectacle, go to the Rocky Mountains of the Grand Canyon. If you want a chance to catch your breath, come to the Flint Hills.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Jim. Yeah, I've, I went out to Symphony in the Flint Hills a few years ago, and that really struck at sunset with the way the light and shadows kind of pool on the hills. That's really memorable, and that was just, I
Yeah,
haven't spent much time there, but and then I think probably many of us have also driven on the interstate during the burning time, and just to see the flames and the smoke, and
yes.
it's beautiful. Yeah. Mhm. Well,
Oh, yeah.
I think
Every so often,
yes. Sorry. What's that? Can you hear me?
I say every so often, some out-of-state motorist will pull into a police office or somewhere in a town and say, "There's a wildfire going out there. There's a wildfire going out there." Don't realize it's not a wildfire. It's an intentional fire. Anyway,
Right.
that's it.
Yeah. Well, thanks. And someone did ask, can we buy your book online? I know it's on Amazon, and probably also on the KU Press website would be a place to buy it, right? And as well
That's
as,
right. Or they can get a hold of me and I'll autograph one for them.
oh, it's very
Yeah,
generous.
that's
Great.
just email.
Yeah, here, I'll put that in the chat, the
Yes.
email you said earlier. Uh, email. And I think that's probably a good, I really appreciate that. It's great note to end it on. And also I'll note, if we don't yet, we will soon have a copy of Jim's book at Newton Public Library, so you can check it out or put a hold on it. And Jim, thanks again so much. It was such a pleasure, and always love to hear your stories.
It's a lot of fun, and I appreciate the good questions.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. Goodbye. See you later.